it's time we get started with biggest vulnerabilities or bugs on a web page. Now, by biggest, I don't mean most dangerous, however, these ones are still not something that you want to have on your web page. We will be starting in this section with cross-site scripting vulnerability, or also known as XSS. Now, you might have noticed that in the upper right corner we have this JavaScript icon. This can give us a hint as to what this vulnerability is. So let's explain it. First of all, XSS is very similar to HTML injection. Those two are executed almost the same way, and since we already covered the HTML injection, this will be a lot easier for you to understand and perform. XSS is based on injecting JavaScript code in the web page. As with the HTML injection, we're looking for a vulnerable user input field that reflects our output somewhere on the page. Once we find it, we try to inject simple JavaScript code to see how the page would react and whether it would execute it. One thing to keep in mind is that XSS is not a vulnerability that targets server. It is a vulnerability that targets clients that use that server. If we are able to inject our malicious JavaScript code in the web page, then that JavaScript code will also run once a different client visits that web page. Now, whether the client visits the web page directly or through a link makes a difference depending on what type of XSS vulnerability it is. And we will discuss different types in just a second, right after we discuss the process of why our JavaScript code executes on a vulnerable web page. So imagine we have this code as an example. It's the same code that we showed inside of our HTML injection, just this time instead of injecting HTML, we want to try to inject JavaScript. And the most simple thing we can run with JavaScript would be the alert function. Of course, once embedding JavaScript inside the HTML code, we must add the open script tags where our JavaScript code starts and close script tags where our JavaScript code ends. This is how the browser will know that it's JavaScript, so it doesn't try to render it as an HTML code. This code being a simple code that asks for someone's name and then reflects it on the page would look something like this once we inject our alert function. And if the website doesn't filter the input, it will process this as JavaScript code and we will get a small pop-up window which is tied to this alert function. That's when we would know that there is an XSS vulnerability. Of course, web page can also have filters that are not properly set. Usually a page can have a filter that says everything between the HTML tags where the user input gets reflected, process it as a regular string or regular text. To bypass only that filter, we could then do something like this. We can first close tags for that line and then run our JavaScript code. In this case, the end closing tag will get left out and it will no longer consider our script as being a part of the open pre-tags. Of course, this is all working considering there are no other input filters. Now, let's talk about two main types of XSS and how they differ. These two types are called reflected XSS and stored XSS. Let's explain reflected XSS first. In reflected XSS, we have an attacker injecting JavaScript code inside a certain web page. The web page processes that input as JavaScript and runs it, letting the attacker know that it's vulnerable to XSS. Then the attacker sends the link to that web page with the JavaScript code set as an input to the vulnerable parameter. Once the target opens the link, it will also run the JavaScript code on the vulnerable website. The XSS where the JavaScript code we inject doesn't get stored and saved on the server is called reflected XSS. On the other hand, Stored XSS is the exact same attack, just this time our JavaScript code gets saved and stored on the server and on the web page. This can be perhaps a web page that offers comment section. If we inject JavaScript code in the comment section, it will run every time someone opens that page. And that's the main difference between these two. In stored XSS, target doesn't have to click on any link at all. They can just go straight to the web page and it will run nonetheless. The stored XSS is more dangerous since it doesn't require the target to open any links, they only need to go to that website. Now, besides these two, there is also something called DOM XSS, or DOM-based XSS, and it's an XSS attack where the attack payload is executed as a result of modifying the DOM environment in the victim's browser used by the original client-side script so that the client-side code runs in an unexpected manner. We will see examples of different XSS types throughout this section. Since this is one of the most common vulnerabilities on a web page, we will devote a little bit more time to it than to other vulnerabilities.